So I want you to imagine an economy that's growing at a blistering, like 16.5% a year.
Which is massive.
Right. I mean, in the financial world, that is the kind of explosive, jaw-dropping boom that is basically supposed to make everyone rich.
Oh, absolutely. It's the kind of number that makes international investors just, salivate.
Exactly. But now I want you to imagine that in that exact same country, despite that massive double-digit growth, the average person is still somehow surviving on less than $2 a day.
Yeah.
Their actual lived reality just hasn't changed a bit. And today, we are looking at what might be, honestly, the ultimate economic paradox.
It really is a profound contradiction. I mean, we are so conditioned to believe that national economic growth automatically equals, individual prosperity.
Right, like a rising tide lifts all boats.
Exactly. The assumption is that if the top line number goes up, well, hospitals get built, schools get funded, and people get wealthier. But when you look at the historical data for the world's low-income countries, the LICs, that fundamental equation just completely breaks down.
And that breakdown is exactly what we're unpacking in this deep dive today.
Oh.
We've got access to this incredibly dense, multidimensional slide presentation.
It's a fantastic report.
It really is. It pulls together macroeconomic data, human capital metrics, environmental tracking, spanning decades, really. But the mission today isn't just to, read you a bunch of numbers off a chart.
No, please don't do that.
Right. We want to understand the actual mechanics underneath them. We want to figure out why the global development playbook seems to be, well, malfunctioning for hundreds of millions of people.
Because the numbers we are going to discuss today are just staggering. I mean, we are talking about billions of dollars in debt, massive shifts in population, and huge environmental transformations.
Yeah.
But before we get lost in the sheer scale of the macroeconomics, we really have to ground this conversation.
I agree.
Every single percentage point we talk about, every shift in a demographic trend, it represents human survival. It represents, a family trying to figure out how to pay for a uniform so their daughter can go to school.
Wow.
Or a farmer looking at a dry field and realizing, well, the rains just aren't coming this year.
That's the perfect lens for this. So we're going to tackle this massive topic by looking at three core pillars. First, we'll diagnose the economic engine itself, which is currently caught in this terrifying debt trap.
Right.
Then we'll move into the human element, the paradox of what happens when a population actually gets healthier and more educated, but the economy has no place for them.
Which is a huge issue.
Totally. And finally, we'll look at the price of all this turbulent progress. The environmental toll and the institutional bottlenecks that just keep these nations locked in a cycle of vulnerability.
So let's start with that economic engine, because if you map out the gross domestic product, the GDP of these low-income countries over the last few decades, it does not look like a steady climb.
No, not at all.
It looks like, well, a seismograph during a massive earthquake.
The volatility is just wild. The data tracks GDP annual growth rates violently swinging between a severe contraction of like negative 4.4% all the way up to that positive 16.5% boom I mentioned earlier.
Yeah, those are extreme swings.
I mean, if I'm managing a business or even just my household budget, I can't function with that kind of unpredictability. Why is their economic output swinging so drastically from year to year?
It really comes down to what economists call external shocks and a total lack of domestic shock absorbers.
Okay, what does that mean in practice?
Well, think about a mature, high-income economy. It's highly diversified, right?
Yeah.
If the technology sector takes a hit, maybe manufacturing or domestic services stay strong.
Right, the whole ship doesn't sink.
Exactly. Plus, a high-income nation has a massive middle class buying local goods, which provides this steady baseline of economic activity.
Yeah.
But low-income countries, historically, they just do not have those buffers.
Oh, I see.
Their economies are often dangerously concentrated on exporting just one or two primary raw materials.
Like, unrefined copper or raw cotton or coffee beans, stuff like that.
Precisely. They are exporting raw commodities to the global market. So if there's a sudden global shortage of copper, the price skyrockets on the international market, and suddenly this low-income country is seeing a 16.5% surge in GDP.
Wow.
It looks like an economic miracle on paper. The government is flush with export taxes.
But the flip side is that they have zero control over those international prices, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like if the global market gets flooded with coffee from another continent, or if a global recession just reduces the demand for raw minerals, the price plummets.
And the entire national economy goes into a free fall. That is exactly what causes those deep negative 4.4% recession.
That's brutal.
And it's not just global markets, by the way. It's also climate vulnerability.
Oh, right. Because of agriculture.
Yeah, exactly. When a significant portion of your economic output is tied to rain-fed agriculture, a single severe drought or a devastating flood doesn't just hurt the farming sector, it triggers a national economic contraction. They are entirely at the mercy of forces outside their borders.
Which I guess explains the second, much more depressing data point in this macroeconomic picture. All these wild swings in GDP growth are basically masking a stagnant reality for the actual citizens.
Yeah, the per capita numbers.
Exactly. When you look at the per capita GDP, the actual economic output divided by the number of people measured in constant 2015 US dollars to account for inflation, it is just a flat line. For decades, it has been hovering right in the $600 to $650 range.
$600 a year. Let's just pause and really consider the mechanics of
It's
that.
hard to even wrap your head around.
Right. That means the total value of everything produced divided by the population equates to roughly $50 a month per person.
It's baffling, though. I mean, if a country occasionally hits 10 or 15% growth, shouldn't that baseline inch upward over time?
You would think so.
How can the growth rate spike so high, yet the per capita income remains literally frozen at $600? Where's the money going?
That is the crux of the vulnerability. When that 16% boom happens, the wealth rarely trickles down. A massive surge in mineral exports might generate huge revenues for, say, a foreign mining conglomerate, and it increases government tax receipts.
Right.
But it doesn't necessarily create millions of high-paying jobs for the local population. It's what we call an enclave economy.
Enclave economy. Okay.
Yeah, the wealth is extracted and sent offshore, or it's absorbed by a very small elite tier of society. And additionally, these countries often have high population growth rates.
Ah, I didn't think of that.
So even if the overall economic pie gets a little bigger, you are slicing it into millions of more pieces every single year. The average citizen's slice never gets larger.
Okay, so the pie isn't growing for the average person, but the economy is physically changing shape. The slide data shows this massive structural shift happening in these low-income countries over time.
Yes, the sector shift.
Historically, these were overwhelmingly agrarian societies, right? But we are seeing the absolute value of the agricultural sector basically stagnating, while the service sector is physically expanding. It's taking up much more space in the national economy.
This is where we run into what the research calls the service sector productivity enigma.
The enigma.
Yeah.
Because if I crack open a standard Economics 101 textbook, it tells me that a shift from agriculture to the service sector is the classic hallmark of modernization.
It's supposed to be, yes.
People leave the farms, they move to the city, they get jobs and services, and the whole country gets richer. But this data explicitly shows that they are not getting richer. So what kind of services are we actually talking about here?
Well, to understand the enigma, we have to look at how much value a single worker actually produces their productivity.
Yeah.
Let's look at the baseline first, the agricultural worker.
Okay.
The data shows that the value created by one single agricultural laborer over an entire year fluctuates between just $800 and $1,000.
That is incredibly low.
Right.
Why is a full year of backbreaking manual labor yielding less than $1,000 of value?
Because it is primarily subsistence farming. These aren't vast mechanized agricultural operations using GPS-guided tractors, high-yield engineered seeds and chemical fertilizers.
Right, it's not industrial farming.
No, this is a family working a small plot of land with hand tools, entirely dependent on seasonal rainfall. A massive amount of their harvest might be lost to pests or rot because they lack proper storage silos or refrigerated transport.
That makes sense.
The physical effort is immense, but the economic value generated is minimal because they lack capital and technology.
I mean, it makes complete sense why someone would want to abandon that. If I'm working from dawn to dusk in a field and only generating $800 of value a year, I am packing up and heading to the capital city to find a better opportunity.
And millions upon millions of people are making that exact same calculation. The rural to urban migration we are seeing is staggering. People are flocking to urban centers seeking a better life. But here is the tragedy of the enigma.
What happens when they get there?
When they arrive in the city, the modern, formal economy isn't there to greet them.
Right, because when we think of the service sector in a high-income country, we imagine software engineering, financial consulting, healthcare administration, or at the very least, structured retail logistics.
Exactly. But in a low-income country, a massive portion of this expanding service sector is entirely informal.
Informal.
Yes. The data shows that service sector productivity is slightly higher than agriculture, around $3,000 to $3,900 per worker. But the crucial insight here is that this curve has hit a flat line.
Really?
Yeah, it has entered a gentle stagnation period, and recently it's even starting to decline.
Wow. Because they aren't getting jobs in, like, air-conditioned bank branches.
Mm.
They're moving to the city and doing whatever it takes to survive on the street.
Precisely. We are basically witnessing the urbanization of poverty. The service sector is expanding in absolute size simply because there are millions of more human beings in the city who need to eat.
So what does that look like on the ground?
The service is someone buying a bulk pack of bottled water and selling individual bottles at a traffic light. It's driving an unregulated transit van. It's setting up a tiny folding table to sell phone chargers.
Oh.
They have traded low-yield, precarious farming for low-yield, precarious street vending.
So they're working incredibly hard, but the economic needle isn't moving because selling a bottle of water at a traffic light doesn't scale. You can't increase your productivity. You can't sell 1,000 bottles a minute. It's a pure survival mechanism.
It is an economy of desperation, not an economy of innovation. And because they are operating in the informal sector, they aren't paying income taxes, their businesses aren't registered, and they have no access to credit to actually grow an enterprise. The national economy looks like it is modernizing because the service sector is growing, but the actual productivity engine is completely stalled.
This raises a terrifying question, though. If the domestic workforce is trapped in this low productivity survival loop, and the per capita GDP is stuck at $600, how are these countries functioning at a state level?
They barely are.
I mean, where is the capital coming from to build roads or run ports or just keep the government lights on?
That brings us to the second massive dynamic we need to explore in the data, the external vulnerability trap. If a country cannot generate sufficient wealth internally, it has to look externally.
Makes sense.
And there are generally two ways foreign capital enters a developing nation: foreign direct investment and debt.
Let's define foreign direct investment, or FDI, really clearly, because the slide on this is just dismal.
It is. So FDI is the good kind of capital. It's when a foreign entity actually brings money into your country to build something tangible. A multinational company builds a textile factory, or an international logistics firm funds a new deepwater port, or a tech company lays down high-speed fiber optic cables. FDI creates actual jobs, it transfers technology and skills to the local workforce, and it generates taxable revenue.
But the data reveals that for these low-income countries, FDI is practically non-existent.
Yeah.
Net FDI inflows as a percentage of their GDP constantly fluctuate between 0.5% and 5%. It is a tiny anemic trickle.
Very small.
Why aren't foreign companies building factories there? If the labor is cheap and people are desperate for work, shouldn't manufacturing be flocking to these cities?
Capital is incredibly risk-averse. A foreign company might look at the cheap labor pool, sure, but then they look at the rest of the ecosystem.
Like what?
They ask, is there a reliable electrical grid, or will my factory face daily blackouts? Are the roads paved so I can actually get my goods to the port? Is the political environment stable? Is the legal system transparent enough that my contracts will be enforced? If the answer to those questions is no, the foreign investors take their money elsewhere.
So the productive wealth-generating investment isn't coming, which leaves the government with only one other lever to pull: borrowing money.
And the numbers here are genuinely frightening.
Yeah, I'm looking at the chart, and we are looking at a trajectory where total external debt, the money owed to foreign creditors, international banks, and other nations, starts out under $10 billion in the early decades. But then it just curves upward.
Exponentially.
Right. It's not just growing. It's an exponential explosion. The total external debt for these nations has now smashed past the $200 billion mark.
It is the definition of a debt snowball. And it is arguably the single greatest threat to their sovereign future.
Wow.
When a country takes on external debt, they have to pay it back in foreign currency, usually US dollars or euros. But remember our earlier discussion, their domestic economy is stagnant. They aren't exporting enough high-value goods to earn those US dollars.
I really want to break down how this actually works because it feels like a household trap on a massive scale. Like if I take out a massive bank loan and I use that money to buy a commercial oven and I start a bakery that makes thousands of dollars a week, that loan was a great idea.
Exactly, because the debt fueled productivity.
But what happens if a country takes out $1 billion loan, but the productivity doesn't follow?
That is exactly what is happening here. The debt scale is inflating exponentially, but the macro vulnerability is deepening. Often, these governments take out loans to build infrastructure, say, a new highway or a dam.
Which sounds good on paper.
Right, but because of inefficiencies or corruption or simply poor planning, that infrastructure never generates the expected economic return. The bakery never opens, to use your analogy,
Oh, man.
but the bank still demands its interest payments every single month.
Honestly, it's worse than the bakery not opening. It's like using multiple high-interest credit cards just to buy basic groceries so your family can survive the week. You aren't investing in your future earning potential. You are just borrowing to keep the lights on today.
Yeah.
But next month, you still have to buy groceries, plus you have to pay the crushing interest on last month's food.
That is a brutally accurate mechanism. In macroeconomics, we call this the loss of fiscal space. When a national government is burdened with hundreds of billions in debt, a massive percentage of their annual tax revenue goes directly out the door just to service the interest payments to foreign creditors.
Before they even spend a single dime on their own citizens.
Exactly. It strips the government of the ability to govern. If 30 or 40% of your national budget is eaten by debt service, you cannot afford to hire more doctors. You cannot afford to repair the power grid. You cannot afford to subsidize fertilizer for those struggling farmers. The government becomes trapped in a cycle where they have to take out new loans just to pay the interest on the old loans. It is a financial straitjacket.
That is, man. Okay, this is a perfect pivot to our second pillar. If the national economic engine is sputtering and the government is trapped in a $200 billion financial straitjacket, what happens to the human beings caught inside this system?
The human toll is immense.
We really need to look at the human capital paradox, specifically education and health, because the data here tells two completely different stories at the exact same time.
It really does. It is a story of incredible logistical triumph, completely undermined by systemic friction. Let's start with the triumph, because the sheer scale of human effort involved in the education data is monumental.
If we look at the historical timeline for primary school enrollment, it is one of the most uplifting trends you can imagine. Decades ago, the primary gross enrollment ratio was sitting below 50%.
Less than half.
Right. More than half of the children in these countries were never stepping foot inside a classroom. But over the years, there has been this relentless, determined climb. And recently, the data crossed a critical threshold. The gross enrollment ratio surpassed 100%.
It's amazing.
They have effectively crossed the critical point of universalization for primary education. Given the massive economic headwinds we just discussed, getting millions of kids into schools is a massive victory.
We absolutely must recognize the global and national campaigns that made that happen. It required building thousands of rural schools, training entire generations of teachers, and fundamentally shifting cultural expectations so that parents sent their kids to school instead of, sending them to work in the fields.
Right, it's a huge shift.
It is a profound shift in human behavior. However, the data forces us to look beyond the enrollment registry and into the actual classroom.
And this is where the paradox hits. I have to admit, when I first looked at these metrics, the math confused me. If the gross enrollment ratio is over 100%, how is it possible that the slide also shows 24 to 30 million primary-age children are still completely out of school?
Yeah, it seems impossible.
How do those two realities coexist?
Well, it's a crucial statistical nuance. The gross enrollment ratio is calculated by taking the total number of students enrolled in primary school, regardless of how old they are, and dividing it by the total population of official primary school-aged children.
Oh, I see.
So imagine a village where a 13-year-old boy is finally able to start the first grade because a school was just built. Or imagine a 10-year-old girl who has had to repeat the second grade 3 times because she keeps having to pull out of school to help her family during harvest season.
Right, they're older, but they're in primary school.
Exactly. Both of those older children are counted in the numerator. They inflate the gross enrollment percentage. You can easily have a gross enrollment ratio of 110% while simultaneously having 20% of your actual 7-year-olds sitting at home uneducated.
So the 100% figure is masking a massive efficiency problem.
The research calls it system internal friction. The education system is basically functioning like an incredibly leaky bucket. You are pouring millions of children into the top of the system, which is a huge achievement, but they're getting stuck. The data shows that the repetition rate for both boys and girls in primary school is stubbornly high, hovering between 10 and 16%.
That means more than 1 in 10 kids is failing to progress to the next grade every single year. Why is that friction so severe?
Think back to the fiscal straitjacket we discussed. A government drowning in external debt can perhaps afford to build a concrete room and call it a school, but they cannot afford to equip it.
Oh,
These children are sitting in classrooms with maybe one textbook for every 10 students. The teacher might be managing a class of 80 children and frankly might not have received a paycheck in 3 months. Furthermore, if a child is malnourished or suffering from chronic malaria, their cognitive development is severely impacted. They simply cannot retain the information.
and so they repeat the grade, and if you repeat the second grade 3 times, eventually your family says, look, this isn't working. We need you to help haul water or sell vegetables.
Exactly.
And they drop out. That completely explains the 30 million kids still out of school.
Yeah.
They are falling through the massive holes in the bottom of that leaky bucket.
Yes. The system has achieved massive scale in terms of bringing bodies into a building, but it has not achieved quality in terms of actual human capital development.
But there is one demographic trend within this education data that we really have to highlight because
Yeah.
it represents a massive cultural earthquake. I'm talking about the gender dividend.
It's a huge bright spot.
When you look at the Gender Parity Index, the GPI for primary and secondary education, the historical baseline is shocking.
It was incredibly skewed. A GPI of 1.0 represents absolute perfect equality between boys and girls. Decades ago, the index was down around 0.64.
Meaning for every 100 boys getting an education, there were only 64 girls. A massive systemic bias against educating women. But the trend line over the last few decades is a steady, steep climb. It has pushed past 0.92 and is rapidly converging on that 1.0 line of total parity.
It's beautiful to see.
The gap is almost entirely closed.
This is genuinely one of the most successful social interventions of the modern era. The cultural shift to recognize that a daughter's brain is just as valuable as a son's brain is transformative. Educating girls has compounding generational effects on public health, family planning, and community resilience.
Absolutely.
But as we are going to see very shortly when we look at the labor market, getting girls into the classroom is only half the battle.
Right. We are definitely bookmarking that because the collision between this educated female population and the actual economy is staggering. But before we look at the workforce, we have to look at the physical bodies of this population. The other side of human capital is health and survival. And the data here reveals a historic reversal of human suffering.
Historic reversal is the exact right phrasing. The extension of life in these low-income countries is breathtaking. Decades ago, the life expectancy at birth was a tragic 41 years old.
41. It's almost impossible to comprehend. You hit your early 40s, and statistically, your life is over.
But the data tracks a massive surge upward. Life expectancy has rapidly climbed to roughly 62 years old. Over the exact same time frame, the absolute number of children dying before their 5th birthday plummeted from a peak of around 2.4 million tragic deaths down to roughly 1.5 million.
Wow.
Still far too many, obviously, but a massive downward trajectory.
How do they achieve that? If the economy is stagnant and the government is broke, how do they add 20 years to the average lifespan?
By conquering the most preventable causes of early death. This wasn't achieved by building state-of-the-art oncology wards or advanced cardiovascular surgical centers.
Right.
It was achieved through the mass deployment of relatively cheap, highly effective, basic public health interventions. We are talking about massive international vaccination campaigns. We are talking about the widespread distribution of oral rehydration salts, which stop children from dying of basic diarrheal diseases.
So simple, but so effective.
Exactly. And the mass distribution of anti-malarial insecticide-treated bed nets.
So it's essentially a massive, globally funded Band-Aid of basic survival that cured the things that were easiest to cure.
Yeah.
But I have to push back here on the reality of that number.
Okay.
62 years old is a massive improvement over 41, but 62 still feels incredibly young to me. I mean, my dad is in his late 60s and he is out hiking every weekend. In a high-income country, 62 is when you start planning your retirement. If the average lifespan in these countries is maxing out at 62, what is still taking these lives before they can reach old age?
That brings us to the grim reality of the current public health burden. In a high-income country, the primary causes of mortality are what we call diseases of aging and lifestyle heart disease, strokes, cancers, Alzheimer's. You survive long enough for your body to naturally break down.
Right.
In low-income countries, they're still fighting the old foes. Over 50% of all deaths are still caused by communicable diseases, maternal conditions, and nutritional deficiencies.
Wow. More than half the population is dying from things we have theoretically known how to treat or prevent for a century.
Yes. And the data specifically highlights the terrifying reality of maternal mortality. The lifetime risk of a woman dying during childbirth or from pregnancy-related complications still shadows these nations heavily.
Why is maternal mortality so stubborn? If they can distribute millions of vaccines and bed nets, why can't they protect mothers?
Because protecting a mother during a complicated labor requires a fundamentally different level of healthcare infrastructure. You can drop a box of vaccines off at a rural clinic in a cooler. But if a woman hemorrhages during childbirth, she needs a fully functioning hospital. She needs a sterile surgical theater, an anesthesiologist, a continuous supply of electricity, a reliable blood bank, and frankly, a paved road to get an ambulance to her village in the first place.
Oh, I see. And because of the $200 billion debt trap and the lack of domestic tax revenue, the government cannot afford to build or staff those deep infrastructure hospitals.
Exactly. The basic interventions extended the lifespan to 62, but without deep structural investments in complex healthcare systems, they hit a hard ceiling.
Okay, let's connect all these threads, because this leads us directly into part 4, the labor market disconnect. We have a population that is surviving much longer. They're getting more basic schooling, even if the quality is leaky, and the gender gap in education has almost closed. So what happens when this healthier, somewhat educated generation wakes up on a Monday morning and tries to participate in the economy?
This is where all the structural failures we've discussed just collide. You have a massive supply of human capital and absolutely no formal demand for it.
The labor force participation data initially looks great. Overall participation is high, somewhere between 60 and 70%. People are out there working. But the massive red flag is how they are employed.
Yeah, categorization is key.
Right. The data breaks employment down into categories, and the portion representing formal, salaried, secure employment is just a tiny sliver at the bottom. The vast, overwhelming majority of workers are categorized under vulnerable employment.
We need to define vulnerable employment clearly. In a formal economy, employment comes with a legal contract. It comes with workplace safety regulations, perhaps employer-sponsored health care, paid sick leave, and unemployment insurance.
Right. A safety net.
Exactly. If the business goes bankrupt or if you break your leg on the job, there is a social safety net beneath you.
Vulnerable employment has zero net.
None. Vulnerable workers are operating entirely in the informal economy. For men, the vulnerable employment rate is between 64 and 70%. For women, it is consistently over 80%. This means over 70% of the entire national workforce lacks any form of Social Security or legal protection.
This isn't labor participation the way we think of it. It's not updating your resume, negotiating a salary, and setting a retirement account. This is waking up every single morning knowing that if you don't hustle, your family does not eat that night.
It's day-to-day survival.
You are a day laborer waiting on a corner, hoping a construction crew picks you up. You are a waste picker scavenging through a landfill.
Right.
You are making clothes in an unregulated fire trap workshop. If you get sick and can't work for a week, you instantly fall into absolute destitution.
It is the ultimate precarious existence. And it connects directly back to the service sector productivity enigma we discussed in part 1. These millions of vulnerable workers are the service sector.
Right, the water bottle sellers.
Yes. They are trapped in micro-enterprises with no capital backing them. The economy is dominated by the informal sector because the formal sector, the factories, the corporate offices, the large-scale agriculture, simply does not exist at a scale necessary to absorb them.
And this brings us back to the gender trap. We celebrated the fact that girls have achieved almost 1.0 parity with boys in primary and secondary education. It was a massive cultural victory. But the workforce data shows that this victory completely evaporates the moment these young women enter the real world.
The economic penalty placed on women is severe. First, there is a massive gap in basic participation. While male labor force participation sits around 77%, Female participation lags far behind, hovering between 55 and 59%.
That is a stark 20% gap right out of the gate.
So millions of educated women are simply blocked from participating in the economy at all, and when they do manage to work, the data shows their rate of vulnerable employment is consistently 10 percentage points higher than it is for men.
If a woman finds a job, it is almost guaranteed to be in the unprotected, informal, precarious sector. Why is this happening? Why doesn't an educated girl have the same economic trajectory as an educated boy?
It is a complex web of cultural norms, legal barriers, and a total lack of social infrastructure. In many of these societies, women carry an overwhelming culturally enforced burden of unpaid domestic labor.
Right.
They are responsible for childcare, elder care, cooking, and the intensely physically demanding task of fetching water and firewood.
Which we know from the infrastructure deficits can take hours every single day.
Exactly. If you are spending 4 hours a day walking to a well and carrying heavy water jugs back to your village, you cannot hold down a 9-to-5 formal job, even if one existed. Furthermore, because the formal job market is so incredibly small, the few secure jobs that do exist are often culturally prioritized for men, who are viewed as the traditional breadwinners.
So women are pushed to the absolute margins of the economy, street vending, or informal domestic work, which are the most vulnerable categories of all.
Yes, it is an immense tragedy. The government and the international community spent billions of dollars and decades of effort to educate these girls, and then the economy simply refuses to let them use that education. You have all this latent human potential, all this intelligence and drive just trapped in an informal survival loop.
Okay, we have covered the economic traps and the human realities. Now we have to move into our final pillar, Part 5, the price of progress. As these nations desperately try to break out of this cycle and industrialize, what is the cost to the physical earth? And what are the institutional bottlenecks preventing change?
The environmental data is perhaps the most sobering warning in this entire deep dive, because it shows that low-income countries are following a very dangerous historical precedent. If we look at the ecological toll, specifically the emission of greenhouse gases, the scale of growth is explosive.
Yeah, the data tracks total greenhouse gas emissions, explicitly excluding land use changes to focus purely on industrial and economic output. And it shows that since 1990, the total emissions from these low-income countries have surged by more than 74%.
It's a massive spike in carbon output.
Additionally, the tracking of PM 2.5 air pollution shows that the vast majority of the population in these nations is now living and breathing air that vastly exceeds the World Health Organization's safety standards.
Which forces us to confront a really uncomfortable historical reality. For the last century, the industrialized nations of the West, and later developing giants like China, built their immense wealth using a very specific playbook. Pollute first, clean up later.
Right.
They burned incredibly cheap, incredibly dirty fossil fuels like unrefined coal to power their industrial revolutions. They poisoned their own air and rivers, generated massive GDP growth, and then, only after they became rich, did they use that wealth to build green technology and enforce environmental regulations.
So the question is, are today's low-income countries essentially forced to repeat that exact same dirty playbook just to survive?
They're certainly trying to. The problem is the timeline and the context. When London or Beijing industrialized, the global climate wasn't teetering on the edge of systemic collapse. Today's LICs are burning cheap fuels to try and build their economies, but as we saw in the macroeconomic data, the wealth isn't materializing.
That is the ultimate tragedy. They are inhaling the smog, they're suffering the respiratory diseases, which we know are still a top killer, but they aren't getting the high-paying factory jobs. It's the environmental destruction of the 19th century without the economic boom of the 20th century.
Smog without the wealth. It is a brutal summary, but entirely accurate. And the ecological toll isn't just in the air, it's happening to the earth beneath their feet. The report details what it calls bleeding natural capital, specifically tracking forest cover.
The slide data here is a relentless downward slope. It shows an irreversible monotonic decline in forest cover, dropping from 27.4% of their total land area down to just 20.4% in recent years.
That is a total loss of 7% of their national territory's forests.
Now, a 7% drop might not sound catastrophic to a casual observer, but why is this such a critical metric for a low-income nation?
Because for a vulnerable population, natural capital is their primary safety net. In a high-income country, a forest is often viewed as a recreational park, or perhaps a managed timber resource. In a low-income country, that forest is an essential ecological buffer.
How so?
First, Energy. Millions of people in the informal economy still rely heavily on gathering firewood or making charcoal as their primary daily cooking fuel. When the forest shrinks, the daily burden of gathering fuel, which, as we discussed, disproportionately falls on women and girls, takes longer and longer.
That makes sense.
Second, agriculture. We know millions are engaged in precarious low-yield farming. Forests prevent massive soil erosion, they regulate local water tables, and they act as a windbreak. When you clear-cut a forest to export the timber or to desperately expand subsistence farmland, you destroy the local microclimate.
So the next time there's a heavy rain, the topsoil just washes away. Or the next time there's a dry season, the local streams dry up completely because the forest capping isn't there to retain the moisture.
Exactly. You are permanently narrowing the ecological buffer that your most vulnerable citizens rely on to survive. It is short-term survival cannibalizing long-term viability.
Which forces us to ask the ultimate question. If the data is this clear, if the World Bank knows this, if the UN knows this, if local economists know this, why is it so incredibly hard to fix? Why can't they just pivot? That brings us to the final piece of data, the institutional bottleneck.
This is where we examine the actual machinery of the state. The data uses a metric called the CPIA score. CPIA stands for Country Policy and Institutional Assessment. It is a comprehensive metric used by international organizations to evaluate the quality of a government's public sector management, their fiscal transparency, and their overall institutional capacity. It's graded on a scale of 1 to 6.
And the scores for these low-income nations are dismal. They are chronically hovering in the 2.5 to 2.9 range. They aren't even hitting the midway point of 3.0. Furthermore, their percentile rankings for things like controlling corruption and enforcing public management are critically low.
No, we need to be very clear here.
Right, yeah. And just to jump in, we're not making political judgments or taking sides on specific administrations here. We're looking purely at the structural capacity of the government as an operating system.
Absolutely. Remaining entirely neutral on the politics, we must impartially analyze what a CPIA score of 2.5 actually means for human development. A government is essentially a massive plumbing system designed to route resources to where they are needed. A low CPIA score means that the plumbing is fundamentally broken and full of leaks.
Let's connect that broken plumbing back to the other pillars we've discussed.
Let's take the external debt. A government might manage to secure a $500 million loan from an international bank to build a state-of-the-art electrical grid, which would theoretically allow foreign companies to build factories, solving the FDI problem.
Right.
But because public management is weak, the procurement process is opaque. Contracts are awarded to unqualified companies. Funds leak out of the system through sheer inefficiency, mismanagement, or graft. 10 years later, the money is gone. The electrical grid still faces daily blackouts, but the citizens are now on the hook to pay back the $500 million plus interest.
Or look at the education data. The international community might provide massive funding to build schools. But without institutional transparency, the funds meant for textbooks disappear, and you end up with a system where 16% of kids are repeating the first grade because there are literally no materials.
Exactly. Weak institutional capacity prevents the structural reforms needed to break the cycle. You cannot enforce environmental regulations to stop the bleeding of natural capital if you don't have a functioning, transparent forestry agency. You cannot formalize the informal labor market and protect women workers if you don't have a functional legal and tax system. The institutional bottleneck is the tiny constricted valve through which every single solution must pass.
Okay, we have covered an immense landscape today. We've looked at the violently fluctuating GDP that masks a stagnant $600 reality. We explored the illusion of the service sector, where millions are trapped in the urbanization of poverty.
It's a lot. We unpacked the terrifying $200 billion debt snowball that is suffocating these governments. We saw the leaky bucket of primary education, the squandered potential of the gender dividend, and the reality of a healthcare system that can keep you alive to 62 but still loses mothers in childbirth. And finally, we confronted the ecological toll of burning dirty fuel without gaining wealth, all overseen by institutions struggling to function. As we move into our summary, I want to synthesize all of this. The final analysis of this slide data points toward 3 massive policy imperatives for the future. The synthesis is stark, but it provides a roadmap. First, regarding the economy and debt, the dangerous cocktail of exponential external debt combined with a low productivity informal service sector just must be dismantled.
Absolutely.
The global financial system has to recognize that these nations cannot simply borrow their way to prosperity if the loans are not generating high-yield formal economic activity. The debt traps must be restructured.
Second, regarding society and human capital. The era of celebrating raw logistics is over. It is no longer enough to just build a concrete room and get a child in a seat. The mandate must shift from expanding quantity to dramatically improving quality.
Yes, learning has to happen.
Exactly. Children must actually retain knowledge. And crucially, that hard-won gender parity in the classroom must be aggressively integrated into the formal labor market. An economy cannot survive with half its brainpower sidelined in vulnerable employment.
And third, regarding environment and governance, there is an absolute necessity to break the reliance on crude natural resource extraction. They have to stop clear-cutting their ecological safety nets, and none of this is possible without completely overhauling institutional transparency to ensure that every dollar of revenue or aid actually reaches the ground.
Which leaves us with a profound question.
It does. I want to leave you with this thought to mull over. For the entire 20th century, the global development playbook was remarkably simple and linear. You move your peasant population from subsistence farms into urban factories. You manufacture cheap goods for the West, generating massive GDP growth. You burn whatever dirty fuel you need to power those factories.
Right.
And then, once your nation becomes wealthy, you use that wealth to build hospitals, clean up the smog, and establish a social safety net. It was a reliable ladder to prosperity.
It's how almost every wealthy nation got to where they are today.
Precisely. But consider everything we have unpacked in this deep dive. Today's low-income countries are trying to climb that exact same ladder, but the rungs have been sawed off. They have a $200 billion debt anchor dragging them down.
Wow.
The global climate crisis means the international community is actively punishing them for trying to burn the cheap fuels that everyone else used. And the globalized economy is rapidly automating manufacturing, skipping straight to high-tech, AI-driven services, meaning the low-skill factory boom is never coming to their cities.
So the old ladder is gone.
Exactly. So the question is, if the old ladder has been pulled up and the 20th century model is definitively broken, how does a low-income country build a completely new blueprint for prosperity in the 21st century?
That is a staggering thought to walk away with. You can't just follow the old map if the actual territory of the world has completely changed. You have to invent a new way forward.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope that the next time you see a headline about global debt or a quick statistic about emerging economies, you remember the incredible human complexity underneath those numbers.
It's never just numbers.
Right. The data is never just a straight line, and the struggle for human progress is the most important story there is. Keep questioning the obvious, keep looking for the mechanisms behind the headlines, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.